Right now, the president speaking at the UN today, throwing foreign policy into the spotlight. Was his decision to skip all one-on-one meetings with other world leaders a misstep? We'll discuss. And next, should schools be able to distribute Plan B, the morning after pill, without parental consent? It's already happening at some schools throughout the Big Apple. Would you want that program to come to a school near you? We ask you this evening to sound off. Plus, the city of Paterson voting this hour whether or not to declare a state of emergency. No, it's not because of some storm or flood, but a man-made crisis of epic proportions, if you believe the city council, when discussing street violence. We speak with the mayor of that beleaguered city to find out what's going on and whether or not he sees eye to eye with the referendum. All right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thanks so much for joining us this Tuesday evening, September 25th. You know, both candidates for president, they were in New York today to talk foreign policy. The president, of course, addressing the UN General Assembly, and both Obama and Romney, they also made speeches at the Clinton Global Initiative. But all eyes are on what didn't happen. The president held no bilateral meetings with other world leaders. He did, however, make time for the ladies of The View. Let's begin with our senior political correspondent, Andrew Whitman, who's here with the latest.
Well, Rich, much of President Obama's address to the UN focused on the Middle East. He talked about the value of diplomacy and free speech, saying, quote, "I accept that people are going to call me awful things every day, and I will always defend their right to do so."
President Obama addressed the United Nations General Assembly this morning during the final stretch of the campaign. During his speech, he paid tribute to the 4 Americans, including Ambassador Chris Stevens, who were killed during the September 11th attacks in Benghazi, Libya.
We must reaffirm that our future will be determined by people like Chris Stevens and not by his killers. Today, we must declare that this violence and intolerance has no place among our United Nations.
The president's remarks at the UN this morning also sent an unmistakable message.
Make no mistake, a nuclear-armed Iran is not a challenge that can be contained. It would threaten the elimination of Israel, the security of Gulf nations, and the stability of the global economy.
Israel has threatened a possible airstrike against Iran if the country does not halt its nuclear ambitions. The Islamic Republic, which insists it would be for peaceful energy only, says any military aggression by Israel will lead to retaliation.
Iran, at the end of the day, is a great country, and let me assure you, we do have all defensive means at our disposal.
Meanwhile, Mitt Romney continued to hammer the president's handling of foreign policy, taking aim at Mr. Obama for describing recent violence in the Middle East as bumps in the road to a more peaceful region.
He said the developments in the Middle East are bumps in the road. Yeah, that was my reaction. Bumps in the road. We had an ambassador assassinated.
The UN meeting didn't stop President Obama from doing a little campaigning. He appeared today on ABC's The View in a pre-taped interview.
Would it be disastrous for the country if Mitt Romney were elected?
Yeah, we can survive a lot. But the American people don't want to just survive. We want everybody to thrive. We want folks to have a shot at success.
And again, President Obama had no meetings scheduled with other world leaders at the UN today. Republicans say the president should have used the time he spent taping The View yesterday to hold those meetings. Now, all of this has thrown foreign policy into the spotlight of the political season, an area where President Obama has been polling well. In the latest Wall Street Journal NBC News poll, which was conducted on September 12th through the 16th at the height of those violent protests in the Middle East and North Africa, 49% of voters say they approved of his handling of foreign policy, but that is a drop from August when he got 54% approval ratings. Even still, voters rate President Obama better on foreign policy than Mitt Romney by 9 points. Rich?
Well, thank you very much, Andrew, and joining us now to discuss not only what we heard today, its significance, but also what we may hear tomorrow. We're joined by Louis Charbonneau, Reuters UN Bureau Chief. Louis, I appreciate a few minutes. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rich. Glad to be here.
There's a couple different references to free speech. To the film that sparked some of the outrage that we saw in the Middle East, but then also with a not-so-veiled reference to the speaker that we'll hear tomorrow.
This is a fact that Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, he can come to New York every year speak at the General Assembly. He can hold press conferences in New York. And even though the United States doesn't have diplomatic relations with Iran, it honors its agreement with the United Nations and allows these people who can't stand our government and who attack the way that the United States government runs things. And so this was something that Obama was yet trying to say, look how different we are. We are expecting Mahmoud Ahmadinejad to say some of the things he said in previous years, particularly regarding Israel and his attacks on the United States and the Europeans, his defense of the Iranian nuclear program. In the past, he's also questioned the fact that, he's questioned the fact that 19 hijackers brought down the World Trade Center and suggested that he might support some of the conspiracy theories. But he's often someone who likes to bring surprises to the United Nations, so he may have something new for us. We don't know.
Well, already in pre-interviews, Louis, and I know you know this, he's talked about eliminating Israel, doubled down on that rhetoric here. He's also spoken about their insignificance. He's said they fully plan to move ahead with their nuclear ambitions and that they take preemptive attacks even on Israel if they thought an attack from Israel would be forthcoming. Could you clear up for our audience? There seems to be this conception out there that because the UN happens to be housed in New York, that the U.S. could unilaterally decide who can and can't speak there. And if they didn't want to let Ahmadinejad have an audience, let alone a platform, they could do so. Not only is that not the case, but also, can you help with some precedent? We've had a lot of unpopular, ugly speakers that have addressed the UN before, and we will going forward regardless of who's president, right?
Right. The U.S. has an agreement with the United Nations, the host country agreement, it's called. And in this agreement, they agree to let these people in, that presidents, leaders of nations, foreign ministers of countries that despise the United States. The U.S. has honored this agreement. They don't always let everyone in. They do have the power to refuse to let these people in, but they do honor their agreement, but they're confined to a narrow strip of land within Manhattan. They can't just venture around. So there are some limitations, but the U.S. considers honoring this agreement to be an important part of its role as the host country for the United Nations.
Obviously, it's an election year, and people put everything into that prism as to both what the president said and what he did or didn't do. A lot of attention being paid here that the president chose not to have any bilateral meetings at these UN, and most specifically, not having a one-on-one with Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel. What is the scuttlebutt that you hear in back channels there? Were people surprised the meeting didn't take place?
Well, I think that people, once it came out that Obama and Netanyahu would not meet here at the General Assembly, it was pretty clear that this had to do with their disagreement about Iran, and maybe they feel, and I'm just speculating here, that without an ability to come out publicly with some sort of agreement in which they can smile and pat each other on the back, that it's better not to do it. It seems that their disagreement is pretty deep at this point. The United States believes there's still room for diplomacy. The Israelis appear to have reached a point where they think that the room for diplomacy is severely diminished, if not gone. So they don't exactly see eye to eye on it. At the same time, they keep saying they both have the same goal in mind, which is to prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon.
Louis, you should have a very interesting day tomorrow. I appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, let's bring in our panel on this. T.J. McCormack, conservative radio talk show host. Dominic Carter, political journalist and author, and a senior political correspondent who you've already met, Andrew Whitman. All right, guys. First off, Andrew, I didn't take any substantive headlines from today. It was kind of a do no harm speech, although, as our guest said, it was a more pointed address than the kumbaya moments maybe of prior addresses to the UN from this president, basically saying, hey, don't just sit on your hands here. If you see violence erupting in the streets, speech is speech, and you should be, forget about more tolerant, you should be basically governing what's going on in your borders right now. I don't know if it fell on deaf ears, but at least from a tonal standpoint, different than last.
Well, it was also a defense of free speech and a defense of the right that led to that video being released, that led to all the violent protests and the death of our ambassador to Libya. Basically is saying, look, you know, that's part of our democracy. That's part of our ability to let people decide for themselves what they want to do, and that needs to be respected around the world. So, you know, I thought there was a little bit of a head nod towards his critics who said, boy, the president's been apologizing for America or hasn't been defending American interests. I think he spent quite a bit of his time at the UN today doing that.
Even though it should be noted, I'm still waiting for the first person to show me that apology he made, or an apologist for America. I still have yet to hear one soundbite. Dom, to my end, this is really ramp up for tomorrow. Tomorrow, when Ahmadinejad goes before, we're going to count how many people are going to walk out of the room, what the reaction's going to be. I think this is going to be largely forgotten. From a risk reward, as I said, we're under 1,000 hours now till the election. Just put it in that context, right?
Hard to believe.
I think today will come and go, tomorrow as well. I don't know the impact on the presidential politics. Do you?
Well, whenever anything happens this close to an election, it's magnified 1,000%. In this case, as you said, we're only about 1,000 hours from the election. I don't know if the Republicans are going to let this go so fast, and I don't know if it was good strategy in terms of the president. Okay, do the View, but perhaps he should have held 1 or 2 meetings as well. Maybe, we don't know what his private schedule was, but I assume...
The argument is that if he did 1, he'd have to do 10. He also did some back-channel meetings. He met with the Yemen premier and also the NSA, and apparently there was another meeting. But, TJ, for me, I don't think in the end the voters really care that much about what happened at the UN this week. Though everyone will consider, we'll see the great headlines from the Post and Daily News about the lunatic and what he says or doesn't say tomorrow. But at the end of the day, is it really going to frame someone's mind? You see the polling, president polling way out ahead of Romney, at least on foreign policy.
Yeah, well, of course, he's the president, and exactly how much opportunity does Mitt Romney have to exercise, you know...
Republicans poll much better than Democrats on.
Well, that's because also people are told to understand that Obama's foreign policy is drone strikes, and that's strong. That's war policy. His foreign policy, I think, is starting to show his personality doesn't exactly lead him to making personal relationships. And I think what we're starting to see is exactly what has America in gridlock is what has us falling short with our foreign policy.
Well,
he does not reach out.
Has he done a great job with the...
That was his diplomacy. He was making a speech. The guy should have been sitting with Netanyahu. The guy should have been... I don't hear anything about Abdullah from Jordan
Americans are alive today because of the president's diplomacy.
Let me tell you something. That's a bit of a leap. There are also Americans, you could say, that are dead today because of his foreign policy and his lack of diplomacy. There are 4 Americans dead in the last 2 weeks. Something else that bothered me a little bit about this speech today was that it furthered this false narrative that attack and all that unrest was based upon a little movie running around on the internet, and that it had nothing to do with that.
I've heard that. Let's say I even grant you for this conversation.
Sure.
You're right. It wasn't a movie. That it was a planned terrorist attack, because certainly the administration seems to be pivoting there.
Sure.
How's that the president's fault? Or any president's fault?
Well, it's not the president's fault, but at the same time, he bears responsibility for what's happening. We had an ambassador
time
with a lock-and-key embassy.
We make this argument, we talk about this, like what happened in Tahrir Square in Egypt, we sort of controlled. As if it would have been in American interest, we're going to go behind Mubarak, as if that would have stopped the Arab Spring, and that's even what we should have done. It's like in Libya, we should have protected Muammar Gaddafi at all costs. Oh no, but then we should have picked a different ruler, which, I don't know, I thought we were trying to purport democracy. We don't like the institutions and the groups that have taken over, but it was never ours to choose to begin with. And I'm not being Pollyannish, I'm being a realist. So how can you say that somehow on Pennsylvania Avenue, he's pulling strings to decide which world leaders and governments are going to be there?
But Richard, that's not what I'm saying. All respect, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, it's not his fault that those attacks happened, but it is also not because of this silly little video. It has to do with what he talked about today. We do have freedom of speech in this country, and they are still attacking us because of our freedoms and our liberties. That is why that happened, and that flies in the face of what he supposedly represents.
One last question. like we said, using the 1,000 hours, the 40-some-odd days,
sure,
voters are going to have a choice.
Mm-hmm.
There has not been any evidence that Mitt Romney has gained any traction with any arguments against his president on foreign policy. To the contrary, the polling number seems to grow. And when I hear about the arguments about Iran, that we're coddling somehow Ahmadinejad without, I do this for a living. I can't tell what the difference is between Romney or Obama in terms of, both of them say we won't allow him to get a nuclear weapon. Well, where's the bright line where you're going to take preemptive military strikes? Are you going to outsource it to Israel? Are we going to have a hand in it? I don't know if there's any daylight between the two of them, and I don't know what their policies are. Do any of you?
The difference is that Mitt Romney wants Benjamin Netanyahu to run American foreign policy in the Middle East, and Barack Obama wants the United States to run American foreign policy in the Middle East.
But no, but then again, but again, what is, when our foreign policy, when our diplomat in chief, when our commander in chief sits there, no, I understand.
What are their plans?
I honestly don't know. Well, what I do know is that the president sits there and says, well, Egypt's not an ally and they're not an enemy, and that, you know, and he has, and again, it is trite, and I hate to be cliche, but he has time for The View and doesn't sit with, I mean, like, even for the optics of it.
But you can't tell me what either policies are or what they should be. And as a consequence here, we're talking about how he spent his time instead of sitting with somebody who decides to go and tell the world that he's not getting a meeting with the president. Well,
apparently part of his policy is to, well, listen, he came into office purporting a policy, putting forth a policy that we can talk to a guy like Ahmadinejad, that I can extend the hand and at least have a conversation. And that has gotten us nowhere. That's at least part of it. That's at least part of his foreign policy, and it has not worked.
That's one difference, Richard. Republicans say that Obama apologizes too much. I mean, I don't know exactly what that means. Does that mean they're going to come forth with a John Wayne attitude? I mean, I don't know. That doesn't mean it works.
My only point is, nobody of the four of us, and we read more than we should on this, can still tell anyone when and where and how we would attack. What are the standards here? What is our line in the sand that we would go after Iran? I still waited for it. I didn't hear it today. Yeah. I haven't heard from Mitt Romney. I don't think we're going to hear it before the election.
Granted.
So for all the talk, at the end of the day, I still can't tell the difference between the two on that one. All right, we take a quick break. When we come back, though, we're going to leave the world of politics, and we're going to get into an issue we touched on yesterday, and you folks overwhelmed us with reaction. We're going to give you a chance to sound off. We're going to bring an expert on the subject as well. It's happening in New York City, and the question every parent out there, you got to have struggled with in the last day or so when you consider it is, should your school be able to give out the morning after pill without you, the parent, even necessarily knowing or approving it? Believe it or not, it's already happening at some schools in New York City, and we're asking you to sound off tonight. Toll-free number open right now. You see the number, 387-666-2428. What do you folks have to say? Answer our question and join our conversation. We'll be right back.